afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Mirella Therese Tiongson from the UP Department of English and Comparative Literature, and I am here to warmly welcome you today to our department's webinar entitled All's Well That Blends Well, Best Practices in Blended Learning Pedagogy. So this is hopefully going to be a productive afternoon of sharing our department's experiences and hearing your reactions as we prepare for next semester where we will be going into blended mode. So this webinar is also being broadcast on Facebook, and thank you to everyone for coming today. So we'll get right to it. So I'm going to be introducing our first speakers. So to talk about how the DECL prepared for blended learning and what we did last semester, may I please call on our current department chair, Professor and Dr. Judy Celine Ick, to share with you our experience. Thank you. Okay.
Hello. Thank you and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here. This will be very brief, but I just like to share a bit of how we made decisions and how we went about the decision to go blended ahead of the curve in the first semester of this academic year. So we went blended. I call it chapter 1 because we're still at the very beginning of a very long learning journey. Okay, let's see. Okay. First, an overview. In the first semester, the English department is a large department. We offered 163 sections of various courses, 19 graduate, 54 undergraduate, 90 GE courses. And you'll see that majority of our graduate classes and GE classes were still completely online, but we had a fair amount of GE courses, 35, that were already in blended mode, and majority of our undergraduate courses were already in blended mode. Now, how did we go about doing this? The first thing we did, of course, academic nerds in the face of the unknown, we go straight to research. And this was the first step in planning for blended learning this past semester. One of the first things we did is we asked our Digital Strategies Committee, that's headed by Dr. Patricia May Hurilla, to prepare a research digest and to present the results of their research to the faculty at large in a faculty meeting last July. Basically, the research digest contains all essential points about blended learning, and then, of course, extended bibliography for people who wanted to do further research. But the point being that the digest already prepared the faculty for at least introduce them to some of the key features of blended learning. And it was with this in mind that we made some decisions. For example, we made decisions on class size. And again, we were guided by our research. I have some bibliographic entries there. These are like the major studies that we looked at. And in terms of class size, for example, our research taught us that the ideal size for blended learning or online learning, the ideal undergraduate class size is 12, which is a far cry from UP's demand of 25. So we kind of adjusted and, looked at it from both sides and decided on a smaller class size of 18 to 20 students per class. We also had to talk about the ratio of online and face-to-face classes. Since we were trying this for the first time, we thought it prudent to stick to the online blended mode. You'll find that there are many different forms of blended learning, but the online blended mode still believes that your main course guide schedule still is majority online, okay, with a few face-to-face sessions. One of the bases for this, again, the article is listed there. This study on the proportion of online and face-to-face components in blended courses. What this study showed us was that, according to the experts in blended learning, 46 to 80%, or a moderate to high number of time in a blended class should still be devoted to online work. So having made these decisions that set our policy, we then moved on to, recalibration. What you find when you move into blended learning is a lot of what you did in online learning is still of use, is still valuable, is still essential. So outcomes-based education, backwards design, forming a community of inquiry in the classroom, cognitive teacher and social presences in design, the teacher as a curator, as content moderator, all of these key ideas that we learned from teaching online were still in place and were still valuable. I put the little address of our webinar last 2021. If you want sort of a refresher on all of these concepts in online learning, just look it up. And then, of course, recalibration also meant a shift in academic policies. We had to decide what does attendance mean if you're doing face-to-face and asynchronous online, what counts as attendance, grading, is it time to go back to our old selves, or are we still in pandemic grading mode? I mean, a lot of these have to be decided upon, and you'll hear from our panelists today about how they made some of these decisions. But basically, we were very excited because we saw that blended learning really brings together the best of both worlds. We can take with us what we learned, and we learned a heck of a lot in the last 2 years about online education, and got back to the affordances and the joys of in-person classes, because there's really no replacement for the liveness of live class discussions. And finally, just responsiveness. This still guides us. It always guides us. We look at blended learning in our departments as a work in progress. Like I said, it's chapter 1, and that we will have to learn as we do. In my own example, for example, I taught 2 classes in blended mode last semester, and I told my students, "This is a laboratory. You're my rats. We're going to, there's a design, sure, but we can break this at any point when we see it's working or not." In fact, at the midterm, for example, for my classes after the reading break, I gave them an assessment of the course. I asked them to tell me what they thought was working, what was not working. And specifically, I asked about face-to-face sessions versus online sessions and the proportion of that. And surprisingly, my students asked for more face-to-face. So that while initially my syllabus only included 4 or 5 face-to-face sessions, after the reading break, we were meeting every other week, because the students felt that 3 asynchronous sessions and then 1 face-to-face was kind of the nice ratio of blended to of online to face-to-face. So really, it's something that you'll figure out. It's be open to the possibilities and be flexible. And I think that we're really looking forward to an exciting time in the university. The second part of preparation, of course, has to do with the really hard material, um, um, resources and retrofitting classrooms. The heavy lifting of that was done by our next speaker, our assistant chair, the heroic Julie Holo. So she'll talk to you about that. So welcome, and I hope you stick around and ask questions later on. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ma'am Judy. Let me just share my screen, and then, yes, we'll go into the heavy lifting, so to speak, of putting together a blended mode for the first semester. All right. So as Ma'am Judy already started to mention, preparations for the blended mode started in July of last year. And one of the first things that we did, and this is also because of the directive from the university, there were a lot of requirements from the university for us to be able to get a permit to hold face-to-face classes, was first to do a consultation with students. So before we formally began putting together the classes and asking for classrooms from the college, we had to know first, were students interested in going back to the university? So before the town hall meeting that you see here, we first filled out a survey for both students and parents. And then the results of that survey we talked about in a meeting where students were able to learn about the results of the survey, and it turned out that a lot of students were still interested in going back to the classroom. But of course, there were specific challenges regarding transport, of course, the safety. There was still like a wave of an increase in infections at the time. So these were negotiated and sort of informed a lot of our steps in deciding to do blended learning for the first semester. One of the main concerns of the students, apart from, of course, having classes face to face, was how would they exist in the university outside of the classes. Of course, the blended mode for the last semester entailed that we would have blended classes in the DECL, but a lot of the students had online classes still. So we talked about how the library can be a space for students to stay, and they could set appointments here. There was also a student lounge that was set up in PAV and in CAL as well, where students can just sit for a couple of hours while waiting for their face-to-face classes, where they could attend online classes. Apart from these concerns from the students, of course, we had to tackle how to structure our classrooms physically. So Ma'am Judy has mentioned that we decided on 18 students, and then some classrooms had a bigger area, so they were able to accommodate 20 students. So these chairs that you see here are spaced 1 meter apart. The entrances to our two buildings, CalNew building and PAV1, were outfitted with scanners, temperature scanners, and we had our IT department set up a QR system for our contact tracing and health declaration. So whenever students would come into, or the preparations, orienting students into how the blended mode will go, revolved around setting up these systems of, before getting to the university, here is what you need to accomplish, here's what you need to register. So a lot of it is physical, yes, the chairs, the stickers on the floors, making sure students know where they can eat. But also a lot of it is, digital. Of course, we wanted to lessen students kind of collecting in certain spaces as much as we can. And then how did we go about, maintaining all of this throughout the semester? For the most part, we had no trouble continuing the system of the classrooms and the health declaration forms. The students were able to access the QR codes in the event that the system might be down in a few occasions, that we still had paper options throughout at the entrances, that people could fill them out as they needed. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we had a town hall meeting where we stressed multiple times that each class would have its own composition of students, and those students would have different needs and different expectations out of the blended mode. So Ma'am Judy has mentioned a lot of the decisions that we made, but a lot of these decisions changed as we went through the semester, and we found that some classes did add more classes face-to-face, while some kind of retained the 4 to 6 sessions. So this is largely what we did to prepare. Of course, the university would have different regulations now, but if you are kind of thinking about how to structure, a physical classroom, or how to go about deliberations and negotiations with students, you will hear more about it in the presentations of our panelists. So this is me. I think our next speaker will talk more about how this actually is grounded in a lot of more research and theory. So, Ree?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ick and Professor Holo, for sharing with us how the department actually, had to prepare both physically and in terms of policy-wise. But of course, these decisions are not just guided by these rules or these ideas. No, we want to stress that our decision to go into blended mode is actually backed up by research. And here to talk about that is our next speaker. So Dr. Marie Aubrey Villaceren. So I'll just introduce her. She's a faculty member of the DECL and the current curricular coordinator of the Creative Writing Program. She is also the Deputy Director for Research and Publication of the UP Center for Women's and Gender Studies and the convener of the Decolonial Studies Program under the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. So thank you, Dr. Villaceren. You may begin. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, Reese. I'll just put up my slides. And you can see me there somewhere in the bottom. Okay, So I've been using online support for my classes since 2012, when I started teaching part-time in a university overseas while I was doing my PhD. So in the 2 years that I taught there, I was exposed to the possibility of holding classes in a brick and mortar institution, pretty much like UP now. But the class readings, the marking of papers, the audio and video recordings of all the lectures, and supplemental videos and other resources were made available online. So some quizzes were also conducted online, and all paper submissions were uploaded to the university's learning management system, which was Moodle. Now, attendance was checked not in the lecture halls, no, where around almost 200 students were enrolled, but in small tutorial sessions. You can think of the tutorial sessions like small breakout groups for those 100 plus students, where the class discussions, they assumed that everyone had gone through the resources, including the lecture hall recordings, no? And the discussions then would launch right away into key concepts in the readings and the issues arising from them. Now, these tutorial classes were also the venue where students can clarify guidelines for assessments. So I didn't really know what it was called then, no, but this is apparently one method by which you can do blended learning. So when I returned to UP, I used available online tools to continue blended classes for my instruction. So in this brief presentation, I'll begin with the definition of blended learning and some of the theories supporting this model. And then it will be followed by the benefits of using the blended learning model, and then some thoughts on how to find the right blend and program design. And then I'll end with potential challenges of the blended learning design. So as with any broad concept that has varied applications across the gamut, let me just move my head there so you can see there. Okay, so as with any broad concept now that has varied applications across multiple concepts, many definitions of blended learning abound, especially since it has been around since, believe this or not, no, since the 1990s. Now, I'm partial to the inclusive definition of Horn and Staker, where they define blended learning as anytime a student learns, at least in part, at a supervised brick and mortar location away from home, and at least in part through the internet with some element of student control over time, place, and or pace. So the goal of blended learning is to create a personalized learning experience. And this learning experience actually leverages the strengths of both online and offline instruction. Now, this approach can be used in a variety of educational settings, and it has been used in primary and secondary schools, in colleges and universities, and then in business training as well. Now, there are several theories that inform the design and implementation of blended learning. Some believe that a blended learning environment actually encourages students to actively engage in the construction of their own understanding of concepts and ideas. So in essence, they become active participants in their construction of knowledge. It's not passively handed over to them, but they are engaged in a way that they are in charge of how to construct their knowledge and understanding of your lessons and of concepts that you present to them. And another theory believes that people are more motivated to learn when they have autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now, in blended learning environments, students are given choice and control over their learning, and it provides opportunities for them to demonstrate their competence and for social interaction and collaboration. And yet another theory also believes that students have different learning styles and needs. Alam natin to, no, as teachers, and that instruction should be tailored to meet those needs. In a blended learning environment, this theory can be supported by providing students with a variety of online resources and activities, which we have done during online instruction, that fit their individual needs as well as their individual learning styles. So you can see that after having briefly gone through yung generalized concepts, generalized theories behind blended learning, you can see that these theories lean heavily on the learner's autonomy and ability to understand and construct their own understanding of the world, and a more inclusive environment as well, and approach to instruction and learning. So when restrictions on physical distancing and movement were imposed during the pandemic, many students and instructors actually lamented the loss of face-to-face and interpersonal contact. In a study conducted by Rotas and Kahapay, which was published in 2020, they reported that students were also suddenly confronted with challenges such as inadequate learning resources, power interruptions, difficulties with communication, poor home learning environments, and conflict with family responsibilities. This is part of the reason why students don't turn on their cameras, right, when we're doing synchronous lessons, no? As well as physical and mental health issues and increasing financial challenges. You only have to look probably at all the email correspondence you've had with students to know that these were real and continue to be real concerns, no, in student lives. Now, in the English department and the rest of UP, teachers had to constantly adapt to and create provisions for calamities, poor internet connections, home environments which are unsuitable for online learning, and as well as the personal challenges faced by students, including online estrangement. This is an occurrence where students do not feel connected to instructors and thereby hesitate or cannot ask for help in understanding their studies or their lessons. But now that restrictions are lifted and physical attendance in brick and mortar institutions are required, blended learning with its in-person and online components can provide the flexibility that both students and teachers require. This is according to Hugh and Chung. In-person classes can address the need for student-to-student and student-to-instructor engagement, and the online segments actually allow students to read and fulfill the activities according to the most convenient time and pace for them. Now, Juban and Wingard, in separate studies conducted in 2004, noted that blended learning actually improves communication between students and instructors, as communication technologies such as email and learning management systems can provide access to course information and materials that may otherwise not be readily accessible or available to students. Juban also, interestingly, also notes that computer-mediated communication tools can also destabilize power relations present in face-to-face communication or consultations. And they note that face-to-face consultations or communications tend to be instructor-led kasi. Now, due to the flexibility provided to both students and instructors and improved communication between students and teachers, studies have shown that blended learning can increase student outcomes and retention rates. And the retention rates are actually similar to those of brick and mortar setups. Okay. So now that we've realized some of the benefits, I've told you some of the benefits of blended learning. How then do we find the right blend? So first of all, let me just say that in terms of the ratio of online to offline components, Hugh and Chang, who I mentioned before, reviewed the literature on blended learning, and they found that adherence to a ratio, for example, 30% online and 70% offline, just as an example, the creation of these ratios, they're arbitrary and subjective, and their effectivity is not well supported in research, and it has not been found to be widely accepted from either teachers or learning program designers. So students have shown that effectiveness of blended learning can vary depending. Studies have shown rather that the effectiveness of blended learning actually depends on a number of factors. First, the quality of online resources and instruction. Another is the level of teacher support and training, as well as the overall design of the blended learning program. So just like online, the online to face-to-face ratio, maybe the next question, is there a specific class size? So again, there is no specific class size that is considered ideal for blended learning, as the appropriate class size, again, will depend on a variety of factors, like the specific goals of the program, the characteristics of the student population, that also comes into it, and the resource and support available to teachers. Hindi lang laging students, we should also think about what resources are available to teachers. But a smaller class size may be beneficial in a blended learning environment, as it would allow for more individualized instruction, as well as support for students, and more opportunities for interaction and collaboration between students and teachers. It has been proven naman in studies, not just about blended learning, that if student to teacher ratio mas mababa ang students, there's more learning going on. Now let's proceed to program design for blended learning. As early as 2014, a graduate student then, called Fu, proposed a framework for designing blended learning. So in this framework, the process begins with the identification of learning goals. Then comes the analysis of learners, meaning your knowledge of the intended recipients, users, or students. It depends on the learning institution that you have, or training institution that you have. Now, this is followed by establishing readiness to go blended. This readiness is determined by an assessment of institutional support, the available infrastructure, the readiness of content to be adapted to the blended learning style, and the readiness of the instructor as well. Okay, now you can see that the readiness of the instructor is actually determined by the institutional support, the infrastructure readiness, and the content readiness as well. And finally, you have student readiness, which is also, again, this is determined in consideration of the first three areas to be assessed. Okay, if the assessment in step 3 shows readiness for blended learning, then the process proceeds to determining the pedagogical approaches to be used. However, if the overall assessment actually suggests an inadequacy in these areas, then the blended learning design should first seek to address, not the blended learning design, but the institution wanting to implement the blended learning design should first seek to address the previous inadequacies. Now, these inadequacies actually draw our attention to the potential challenges of implementing a blended learning design, and they can include, just move my face. So first, you have difficulty in creating and managing technology, the technological infrastructure that is necessary to support blended learning, such as, for example, reliable internet access. We live in the Philippines, so we know how this goes, and appropriate hardware and software, especially for institutions. Now, insufficient training and support for teachers in the use of technology and online resources can also be a challenge. We know about this because some people were, when we were launching our online instruction, we needed to do a lot of training for people who were parang nangangapa when it comes to using online resources. And when this happens, when there's insufficient training and support for teachers, this can lead to poor integration of these tools for instruction. Now, limited opportunities for peer-to-peer interaction and collaboration can also occur, and this can have negative impacts on student engagement and learning. And then, pretty important for us in the department, it would be increased workload for teachers who may need to create and manage online materials in addition to traditional classroom instruction. And this is why teacher support and then, training when it comes to program design is very important when you're trying to implement blended learning. And then there's also this potential for students to disengage from the online portion of the instruction. And this can lead to a lack of progress or understanding in certain areas of the curriculum. There can also be problems when it comes to equity, as not all students have access to the necessary technology or internet connectivity to fully participate in blended learning. I just recall that in the department, we actually made provisions for students who have very weak or no internet connectivity due to their location or their particular circumstances. So this is something to think about as well. And then also, finally, the difficulty to track student progress and measure the effectiveness of blended learning. So as we implement blended learning into our classes, I think it's also very important for us to later on assess the effectivity of this for not only the students, but also the teachers, and the institution. Okay, so last semester, some teachers in the English department, as Judy and Julie mentioned, conducted our classes using the blended learning approach. So aside from the infrastructural, environmental, personal, and other challenges to learning, that Rotas and Kahapay mentioned in their study about learning during the pandemic, there were other challenges faced by teachers, which we at the department talked about informally amongst ourselves. But along with these challenges were certain joys, such as face-to-face interaction with students, which produced a warmer, more personal kind of engagement and instruction. The separation of work and home life, which is pretty important for some people, and meeting up and catching up as well, no, with colleagues. So the next part of our program will provide evidence, because we need evidence, right, on the application of a blended learning approach. And will also be an exciting sharing of experiences of teachers who practiced blended learning last semester. So their challenges, their triumphs, and their important now, their recommendations for moving forward as we open the doors of our classrooms to in-person classes. So that's it for me. Thank you all for listening so far. And I hope that you can keep some of these notes in mind as we listen to our panel later on. So if anyone is interested, then here are the references used in this particular presentation. Thank you all.
All right, so thank you, Marby, for sharing your experience and providing us with some theoretical background. And actually, as we can see, there's really a lot to consider and a lot to think about. But like we mentioned, no, apart from providing you the administrative and the theoretical angle, the heart of this webinar is really we've invited some of our colleagues to share their experiences and to walk us through. And we hope that this is something that will be useful for you. So the rest of the webinar will just focus on the sharing. So what I'll be doing is I'll be introducing each speaker, and then each speaker will share their answers to basically what were the challenges, what were the joys, and what were their best practices or realizations that came from their experience. And then after all our panelists have spoken, we will have an open forum. So we encourage everyone to please interact with us, and please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will go through them and hopefully be able to learn from each other until the end of at the end of the presentations. Okay, so that said, let's go and call our first presenter. Okay, so Professor Lauren Evangelista Agaloos is an assistant professor of English Studies Literature at the DECL. She earned her MA in English Literature from the University of Warwick and has been with the department since 2018. Prior to joining the DECL, Lauren worked as a managing editor and freelance writer for lifestyle publications. So, Professor Agaloos, please, you may begin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Reese, and good afternoon to everyone. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So many thanks again for that introduction, Reese, and thank you as well to everyone who is here listening to this webinar or watching it. As Reese has already mentioned and the previous speakers have said, I will be sharing some of my best practices. We only have 5 minutes to do so, so this won't take very long. But again, if you have any questions, then I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A later on. And so just as a brief background of what I taught last semester, so I taught English 21, which is Survey of English Literature from the Old English to the 18th century. And that had about 20 students in it. And then English 131 was the second course I taught. It's a course on modern British literature, and it had 17 students. In terms of the platforms that I used, I stuck to the same ones that I had been using even prior to the pandemic. So I was still using Google Classroom, Zoom, and then on top of that, activities were done on Jamboard, Google Slides, and a few of them done on quizzes and Mentimeter, and then occasionally the use of Wheel of Names as well. For my slides and the few audio guides that I used for my modules, I also referred to Canva. So we were asked to talk about very briefly, the challenges that we encountered, and I think I thought about this question in terms of these two concepts. So the first is this concept of time in the classroom and how we think about it. So how do we define what we mean by attendance and deadlines? I think Dr. Ik already mentioned this concept of attendance earlier on, and so I had to contend with that idea in the classroom. And I think this wasn't specific to the blended learning platform, but even prior to that, I'd already been thinking about it. And I think, as has already been mentioned, this is still a work in progress. And I think this is something that I still want to teach my students and kind of talk about it with them. Second is, how do I make sure that the students who chose to continue with their activities in a self-paced manner, meaning just using the guides that I produced, how do I make sure that they can still be engaged even though they choose or they cannot participate during activities on campus? So how do I make sure that those two still kind of work together and they're able to still participate in with the best ways that they can? In terms of the rewards and the realizations, I found that students were actually eager to learn. Okay? They were happy to be there, and they are actually able to show us their appreciation for their efforts. So whether they've chosen to do the class completely online or they are there in the classroom, I found that the enthusiasm is still there. And then also that blended learning actually forces us to plan ahead, but again, to be flexible and to adapt along the way. And then lastly, in terms of just a few tips and practices that I can share, it helped me to be able to create very detailed course packs, but also, again, be open to changing them, but still, of course, be able to communicate that clearly to your students. And second is to have constant consultation with their students, what works or isn't working for them. So this can happen in the middle of the semester, even as you're doing these activities. And then lastly, such an occasion as this, okay, to maximize peer support and mentoring, to really think about what you're doing, but also kind of have the chance to talk about it with your colleagues, as we've done also in the DECL, whether in a formal or a structured equation such as this one, or informally, just amongst ourselves. So that's it for me. I think, again, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them in the Q&A later on. So thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Lauren, for getting us started with those important points for reflection. So let's move on to our next speaker. So Professor Irish Joy de Ocampo is a faculty member at the DECL. She has a bachelor degree in English Studies major in language from UP, and she recently earned an advanced master's degree in cultural anthropology and development studies from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. Her research interests explore multimodality, critical pedagogy, and gender and development studies. So, Professor De Ocampo, so thank you.
Thank you, Reese, for that introduction. So I'm also going to talk briefly about my challenges and realizations, and also, most importantly, the joys of venturing into the unknown. That is the blended setup in the university. So, like Lauren, and I think I thank our first speakers who already provided some context as to what this looked like for us last semester. So specifically, I would like to talk about my experience in teaching English 13, which is a general education course offered by the university. So last semester, I was assigned to teach a big class with the support of two teaching fellows. So I was assigned 18 students. And so here is my class photo last semester. And as you can see, it's a Gen Z selfie, and that's what it looks like. Same with Lauren earlier. My class setup was a combination of online and face to face. Mostly, it was a combination of Google Classroom and synthesis discussions live. Um, and so my writing assignments and my pre face to face discussion questions are posted in the Google Classroom, and then the synthesis lecture and discussions were done face to face. I'd like to comment or perhaps like highlight how English 13 particularly is already intuitively designed for collaborative learning. So I think it was not that challenging to somehow transition to a purely online and then eventually to a blended setup, because the design of writing as thinking or English 13 already talks about or highlights the processual nature of academic writing, which is framed as a translation of critical reading and writing. So I think in terms of the content, it was not very challenging for me. However, the growing pains or the challenges that came with the shift to blended, and I think these have been touched on by our earlier speakers, was first infrastructural support. Luckily, last semester, most or all of my students were from NCR. I think only two were outside of NCR, but they lived in Rizal, and which is essentially kind of NCR already. So it was not difficult to design or to ask the students to come to class. Um, but I think one of the major problems was the Wi-Fi connection in the buildings in the college building. And so, for example, when there were students, when there were certain face-to-face sessions when students could not come because they are sick or there's some external problem, it was mostly difficult to hold a face-to-face session where maybe a majority of the class were present in the classroom and then two students are on Zoom. And so I tried it for the first time during my second face-to-face, and it proved to be difficult because we were all wearing face masks and they couldn't really hear us via the audio. So we figured that maybe the discussion questions that we discussed in class were also posted to the Google Classroom, and then they can decide asynchronously and discuss them amongst themselves for those who weren't able to attend online. I mean on site, and then class preparation as well. So I think it was at first difficult to figure out which parts of the syllabus needed to be on site and which parts can still be done online. And so, as I mentioned earlier, what I did was I decided that the face-to-face sessions will be for synthesis lectures and class discussions, and pre-writing activities were provided or were posted to the Google Classroom. And I think it really provided, or I think Marvin touched on the combination of autonomy and also collaborative learning, because I saw how most of my students were more prepared during the face-to-face discussion than in my pre-pandemic lectures, wherein I know some of my students weren't reading or did not read the text assigned. But I feel that in the blended learning, when they do come to the face-to-face sessions, um, I feel that most of them are prepared. They're all willing to share their insights, and I do credit that to the pre-discussion questions that were posted online before I asked them to come to class. So I think that was one of the good things about the blended setup. But of course, another challenge, and I think it will be more pronounced in this coming semester, is the commute. So personally, it was a bit more challenging to have to uh, survive commuting from my place to the campus. And so I also had to adjust issues on punctuality. And so for the joys, of course, nothing beats a face-to-face discussion. So these were like the first session and the last session with my students. And I think that what has been highlighted to me is the processual nature of learning, and that ultimately teaching is community building, and that it is essential to teach with intention and attention. So I think that's all I can share for now. And then later on, if the others have questions, I'd be happy to answer that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Irish, for that reminder and for giving us tips on how we can build our communities both online and on-site. So for our next speaker, I would like to call on Dr. Christine Rinaldo. Also, Dr. Rinaldo did her PhD in Cultural Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, where she started teaching hybrid and blended classes in 2019. This past semester, she taught one GE class and two survey or upper division classes using both hybrid and blended learning modalities. Okay, so Dr. Rinaldo, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be discussing my experience of trying out a high flex arrangement for my classes this semester. And I prepared a lot of points, so I'll be running through all of these. And then if you would like me to elaborate on certain points, please just note the things that you would like me to further discuss. So before I started the semester, before I started meeting my students, I sent them a survey about their level of commitment for attending face-to-face classes. And I found out that in my 3 classes, most of the students, actually, the majority of the students wanted to attend face-to-face classes and were willing to commit to attending the pre-scheduled face-to-face classes. But then I also saw that a considerable percentage of each class, ranging from say 25 to 40%, could not commit to attending face-to-face classes. So I decided that for those students who could not attend face-to-face because they were living outside of Metro Manila, or they had a lot of caregiving responsibilities at home, or they had part-time work. For those students, I decided to try to do a hybrid setup, a high flex setup for my classes. So this is the setup for my online only class. I usually work with 2 monitors. So one monitor is what I use for monitoring the Zoom classroom, so I can see if somebody's raising their hand or somebody's typing in the chat box. And then I use a second monitor for the material that I share screen, like links, or if we need to look up something in class, I also look up something in real time, so they can see how you can do quick searches also through Google Scholar, for example. And then I often also keep my own personal notes on the side. So this is how my online only setup would look like. It's not clear in the image, but this is a condenser microphone. So I invested in a condenser microphone because the clarity of the audio is very important to me, and my laptop doesn't really pick up sounds that well. So I also got a condenser microphone. So for classes, I mostly, for synchronous online classes, I usually use Zoom because that is also the preferred platform of my students. And then I put up class materials, class feedback, submission bins, etc. on Google Classroom. Same with Irish earlier, I usually scheduled synchronous sessions for revision and synthesis session. And then a lot of discussions also happen on Google Classroom on discussion boards. Aside from Google Classroom, I also have a teaching portfolio. So I have a website where I put up all of the course all of the course syllabi and course packs that I've designed. They're all on my website. And on my website, I also put supplementary material. So if students want to look up something, or if I need to quickly refer to a material while I'm holding my online class, I often use my website because I've archived a lot of materials there. Aside from that, I also maintain a YouTube channel. The DCL has its own YouTube channel, but I feel a bit shy about sharing my content with that bigger channel. So I just share these materials with my own students, and I have a mix of short videos and long videos, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, and this is my physical classroom. This classroom is one of the bigger classrooms in PAV. And the great thing about this classroom is that it's right next to the DECL office. So I could connect to the DECL Wi-Fi, which is quite fast, and which is the most important reason why I was able to do a high flex setup, because the DECL Wi-Fi is fast. But this isn't how I conduct classes. Usually I would have the students sit in a circle, and I would usually be sitting in the chair nearest to the monitor, and I would have the table here, for example, and I would have my laptop open, and I'll be sharing screen, and I'll be also flashing the Zoom classroom here, and then as I speak with the rest of the class. Aside from having this set up, for the recitations for the HyFlex classroom, I also invested in wireless Bluetooth microphones. So I have this kit. This is a wireless Bluetooth microphone, which contains 2 microphones. I usually keep one for myself, and then 1 microphone goes around the class. And I know there's a low-key, yucky factor there because, germs, but I do encourage students to like disinfect the microphone and to wear masks at all times. So the important thing for me was for the students in the Zoom classroom to be able to hear the discussion that's happening in the physical classroom. I also often used a camera, because if I have my laptop beside me in class, and if I turn on my camera there, the people on Zoom, the Zoomers, will just see my face, and I don't want them to just look at my face. So I usually brought a webcam that helps show the rest of the class, so that the Zoomers see my screen, and their point of view allows them to see the rest of the class in the classroom. And all of that I did in order to kind of help cultivate a sense of togetherness, even in the HyFlex remote setup. So some of the challenges I encountered include logistical, material, and technical. I won't elaborate these because so the previous speakers already spoke a bit about that. But for logistical things, for all of the things that I specifically bought for online class, I probably spent about 14,000 for the cameras, the speakers, the microphones, etc. So that's one challenge, the capital outlay necessary for DIYing your HyFlex classroom. Other logistical challenges, setting up the hybrid thing takes time. It could take up to 10 to 15 minutes, and it cuts into discussion time. It takes more time if we're encountering technical difficulties, because then I would need to go to the DECL and ask one of the staff to help with the setup. So material and technical difficulties, hardware malfunction, power interruption, slow internet. But the greatest difficulty I found in the hybrid setup was pedagogical. So for example, when I'm doing a HyFlex classroom, I have to mind the people in the room as well as the people on Zoom. And so it's difficult when you're minding 2 spaces at the same time. It's kind of difficult to be really focused and present, which is necessary when somebody's reciting. You want to make them feel like you're actually listening carefully to what they're saying. And that's difficult if at the same time that you're listening to them, you're also monitoring Zoom for comments in the chat box or questions, etc. So because of that, what tends to happen is that I tend to just focus on the physical classroom and engage with the students in the physical classroom, and the Zoomers tend to be relegated to a more passive role. Another difficulty that is related to the online setup, but not just because of the online setup, is the existence of disruptive innovations. For example, AI generated AI text generators. And I think I'm just putting it out there, but I think this is something that merits a separate forum, a more expanded forum for us to address. Okay, so joys, tips, and best practices. So this is a picture of one of my HyFlex classrooms. This was a really fun class. So as Irish already pointed out, some of the joys include more considered and purposeful discussions, because they come to class more prepared, because they've already done the preliminary discussion exercises on Google Classroom. The HyFlex classroom, or the blended option, also facilitated greater rapport and camaraderie among the students and between the students and myself. And I found that really plays a huge role in facilitating student engagement and motivation, as well as instructor engagement and motivation. Another joy that came out of this is I was very impressed with the student-led or student-directed projects for their final projects. So for example, I had, for final projects, I got a lot of impressive transmedial work like websites, podcasts, vlogs, music, comics, scenes, etc. And this is one of my favorite projects from last semester from English 114. This is a website that the students Bea Cayone and Alex Lanting created to explore the historical, political, economic, and cultural contexts of one of the books that we discussed. Other joys, more time to prepare and think and rest, or the joy of not having to commute every day. What else? So that's it for joys. For realization, some of the things that I realized: first, effective learning is fundamentally affective. So teachers don't just deliver content, they design, build, and facilitate intellectual and emotional experiences. So realizing that, the question for me is, how can we motivate students to be active participants in their own learning? How may we create spaces for cultivating communities of learning and a sense of togetherness, even in a remote setup? Another thing that I realized is that students and teachers do try to do their best work despite overwhelm. And I realized this because sometimes when you're not meeting students twice a week, every week, you kind of worry if they're actually doing the thing that you feel like they're supposed to do. But I realized that given our current setup where teaching often happens by assigning a lot of work and then checking the work and then giving feedback and then assigning more work again. In that kind of setup, it's very easy to assign too much and everyone then ends up feeling really tired. So this is an image that I got from Reddit, where I also lurk. And this is in relation to a post by a student about all of the backlogs they're dealing with during their reading break. What I realized is that incessant productivity is not really that healthy. So for me, another question is, how can we gauge students' learning aside from assigning more output-based work? And I realized that it's kind of weird that this is coming from me because I apparently have a reputation for assigning a lot of stuff. So this is also a question that I pose to myself. Like, how do I be really intentional about the amount of work that I am assigning? Another realization, or my final realization, is that the rotation of online only and face-to-face only classes, I think, would work better than high flex for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So some best practices or tips: first, get in sync, or be on the same page with your students, especially when you have a lot of async activities. Plan ahead, but structure with flexibility. Second, collaborative work and peer learning are essential for students, especially in a remote setup, but you also need to have explicit guidelines and mechanisms for accountability. And for example, I could show this later. These are feedback that I got from students when they did their peer evaluation, and I put clear rubrics for peer evaluation. So aside from these mechanisms for accountability, curating low stakes and small tasks that build toward bigger projects or final work. So for example, these are my requirements for English 10. These are all small works. And then I tell them that as long as you submit it, you get the full points for the requirement. And all of these tasks are working towards their big output, which is the analytical paper. So curate low stakes and small tasks that build toward bigger projects and final work. Guide questions posted in advance, supplemented by recordings posted within a week of the discussion to aid in recall. Another realization or tip: teachers don't have to create instructional materials from scratch because there's so much out there on the internet. But if we want to create materials from scratch, it helps to learn what makes a teaching video effective, for example. And in relation to that, I would like to refer to these characteristics of an effective lecture video. I could also show this later, but these characteristics I also gleaned from one of the papers that a student in my English 13 class wrote last semester. So he researched about the effectiveness of recorded video lectures for Math 20 and 21, and he interviewed 36 students about what makes an effective lecture video. So I could also elaborate on these later. That's it from my end. Thank you for listening, and I would be happy to answer questions later.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Rinaldo. Clearly you showed us that learning is an investment, right, for both the teachers and the students. And I'm sure we'll be getting a lot of questions about how you set up your high flex modality. So next, I will call our next speaker. So Dr. Maria Lorena M. Santos is an associate professor at the DECL. She has published papers and delivered talks based on her research on adaptation and appropriation, intertextuality, and fandom in popular culture, spinning off from her PhD at NUS on the cultural phenomenon of global fan communities, inspired by Jane Austen. So her recent publications have been about Filipino intersections with Western texts and tropes, a book chapter in Robinson Crusoe in Asia, and a forthcoming chapter in the book Superheroes Beyond. And she's currently working on a research project on the retellings of Austen's Pride and Prejudice by Filipino authors. So with that, let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Santos. So, Dr.
Hi.
Santos.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Reese. Good afternoon to everybody. And thank you to my colleagues who have already shared a lot of very interesting ideas. Let me share my screen. So like the rest, I'm going to talk about the joys and challenges of blended learning. No, I titled my few slides here, Happy Blendings, Best Practices. So I'll also be talking about I'll also be sharing some tips based on what worked for me last semester. So my colleagues have already talked about, have already spoken about the joy of holding classes again in an actual classroom with students who are similarly aware of the privilege of being in that classroom. So like they mentioned, the discussions felt more lively and dynamic because of our physical presence in a classroom and the sense that we all wanted to be there. So one of my biggest challenges in shifting back to in-person discussions was I decided to focus on just this one challenge, redundancy. So my pandemic study guides prepared over several semesters had been designed for independent learning with modules that contained walkthroughs and notes that were meant to take the place of my classroom voice. So I worried about repeating myself during in-person classes or being redundant. So I felt like I faced this challenge better in my literature class. I had 2 classes that I taught in blended mode. So the study guides still worked well. Like Dr. Ik mentioned, a lot of these techniques that we use for online learning still work for the blended mode. So for this class, my study guides still worked because the students came to class having not only read the assigned texts and background information, but as mentioned by my colleagues, they came to class with well thought out responses to guide questions that they received ahead of time. So that meant that we were able to maximize the time during face-to-face sessions for processing responses. So no more talking about background information. So the time was better spent processing responses and following up on ideas during these live discussions. So sometimes we would follow up on ideas that had been raised earlier in the classroom discussion forum. So as mentioned before, the live discussion worked much better than synchronous chats or synchronous Zoom sessions. The detailed guides also helped train students to prepare their own materials for student-led discussions, with a focus on refining their questioning techniques and their approaches to texts. So challenges. Now, this didn't work out so well with my history of English class. So I've put the heading different, I've put the note there, different strokes here, because for this class, there was a lot of technical subject matter to cover, linguistic features. And I found myself not only having lengthy study guides with this content, but also spending too much time explaining technical subject matter in class, ending up with not enough time for interactive idea sharing about the implications of linguistic developments, basically the more interesting interactive types of discussions. So this coming semester, I'm going to teach this again, and I have a different plan to lessen the teacher voice in some of my module study guides in order to avoid redundancy, and then to more carefully plan 2 different types of face-to-face sessions. Some perhaps more lecture-focused to explain some of the aspects that students identify as requiring further clarification or explanation. And then some focusing on talking about connections between linguistic changes in the past and present day developments in English. So what last semester taught me was that I really have to plan different kinds of face-to-face components or discussion components for different types of classes, literature and language. So my tip to others and to myself is to really plan carefully. So this is a snippet of my one of my course schedules with the face-to-face class highlighted in pink. So plan carefully. Take advantage of the benefits of both modes of learning. So we can continue to provide students with materials that will help them learn independently, because we've had a lot of practice doing that in the past semesters. And at the same time, plan face-to-face sessions that maximize teacher-student engagement and that suit the classes that we're teaching. So now that we know what still works online and what works best in a live classroom setting. So I'll share some of my practices, some of the practices that work very well for me in that literature class on Anglo-American women writers. This is the classworks section of our Google Classroom for that class. So the DECL last semester planned for just 4 or 5 face-to-face sessions scheduled on specific and fixed weeks of the semester. So I had to very carefully consider how these would work best for this class. So during online work weeks, my students made use of various resources. So not just the study guides that I provided, but other supplementary materials available to them in the online mode. So for example, they took a warm-up quiz on quizzes to assess their knowledge about women writers in the Anglo-American tradition. And this was not graded. They just had to reflect on how well they thought they did or why they had difficulty with a short quiz. And they watched a 12-minute lecture that I prepared on women writers from a certain historical period in preparation for the work that they also had to do. So the video that I created modeled for them what they would need to do for their own talking presentations about other periods in women's literary history. So these are shots of the talking presentations that they prepared. And I told them, this is a model or guide, but you can do better than me with the visuals and with the technology that you're familiar with. And they really came up with very good work. They asynchronously read assigned texts and prepared responses to questions for sharing either in our online discussion forum or in face-to-face during face-to-face sessions. They annotated sections of a long reading and they read their classmates' annotations and also responded. Okay, so I asked permission to share some of their output, and this is a screenshot of the Google Docs where there are student responses. So I would respond to some, but not all of them, and I invited them to engage with each other. Using this simple annotation, feature on Google Docs. They worked also during online downtime. They worked on group presentations and on several topic building tasks for their final projects. So throughout the semester, I had 4 or 5 topic building tasks, stage 1, stage 2, where they kept building on their ideas for their final projects or their final papers. So I didn't ask them to submit this, but this was a way of keeping them on track so they wouldn't cram the project at the end of the semester. And there were also some questions or guidelines that would link the topic building task to the lesson that we had just discussed. So I also met with smaller groups via Zoom to discuss their plans for the study guides that they also had to create and the student-led discussions that they were preparing for. Our few face-to-face sessions were very discussion focused. So this is this is a Gen X selfie because I'm Gen X. So for the first face-to-face session on week 2, we shared our responses to a reading on Western feminist literary criticism, and we worked together on framing questions coming from our own politics of reading. So that was the first face-to-face session. The second, held on week 5, involved my facilitating a discussion as a model for what they would have to do. Okay, so I facilitated a discussion of 3 short texts clustered around a gender-focused theme. 4 of the class groups later created online study guides and exchanged thoughts on Discord. So they led discussions on Discord, be it posting questions, waiting for their classmates to respond, responding to these, and coming up with a synthesis or processing post at the end, supplemented by me when they were all done. And so they had activities, pre-reading activities, because I also prepared some of those. So these are the ones prepared by my students on gender stereotypes, the menstrual cycle, period myths, the relevance of marriage in women's lives in the literature that we tackled. And one group, so 4 of the groups facilitated discussions online and created online content, learning materials, while one group facilitated the discussion during our 3rd in-person session or face-to-face session on week 11. So I turned that discussion over to them, and they really made the most of it. They not only prepared study guides, shorter than those prepared by their classmates, but they shared a short video and they processed the discussion during that face-to-face session. They were working on texts dealing with rape culture and fantasies of consent. So this felt like the best topic to work on during a face-to-face session. For the last face-to-face session, I shared my own research involving, these are more of their materials. Okay. This is about, gender roles. So these are some of the activities that they shared, that they asked their classmates to fill out. So you'll see check marks because their classmates, oops, sorry, I forgot to blur the name, but it's just the first name. Check marks as a response to these activities. So they also shared these online. And I also answered some of these checklists myself. So for the last face-to-face session, I shared my own research involving gender and literature. And we had a Q&A session. And one of the things that I'd like to do next semester is also have a face-to-face session devoted to having students share their own plans for their final projects. So I'll again model it for them with an example of the kind of research that they're supposed to do, and then they can present their ideas. So and here are some of their final projects. So some of them created digital archives on a new theme and set of texts that if they had control over the class, they would have wanted to include in the reading list. And some of them went for the more traditional term paper task. So I also gave those 2 options at the end as a form of, well, to align it also with the blended mode. So just to close, the balance of online and face-to-face components of this class produced, I felt, some of the best discussion forum responses I've seen, some of the best online study guides and final projects from students. The blended mode helped students achieve through interactive activities and self-study, not only the goals of the course, but also they also more effectively, I felt, learned how to process and curate content in 2 different modes. So that was one of my biggest realizations this semester, that, one, that I had to plan carefully for this new mode, and really takes a lot of careful planning plus flexibility. Also that it offers opportunities for students to also learn how to curate content and think about projects and texts in new ways. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Santos, and I'm sure we'll be able to hear a lot more from everyone, especially just what considerations to take and how to plan. So thank you. And finally, for our last speaker, so Professor Luis Jaciel Sonido teaches at the UP Department of English and Comparative Literature. She's a multimedia artist and a cultural worker, and also is our current Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at UP Diliman. So now I'll call on Professor Sonido. So thank you.
Thank you, Riz. Thanks, everybody. Mine will be quite short. I'm at 5 slides. I hope I'll just add to a lot of what was already discussed, and kind of share with you how I handled my 2 classes also last semester. It was quite fun. It was quite interesting, to say the least. So everybody's kind of starting off with, here's a picture of my class. So here's a picture of our class. And it still, as you can see, it was still predominantly Zoom. This was not the usual division, actually. So a lot of the faces that you see on the individual screens would actually come to face-to-face sessions as well. So it was just this particular photo, they were on Zoom. So I did conduct my class in a kind of audio-based HyFlex. I'll talk about it a little bit more later on. But just to go through the prompts for this particular discussion, some of the challenges that I confronted, we all confronted, I suppose, going into the first semester, which I treated as a kind of transition, right? It was really a transition period of kind of coming back to campus, reopening, gradually, partially, safely. So there were some things that we needed to really think about. Like the first one was overcoming the fear of COVID-19. I needed to see also, I need to check the disposition of my classes, my students, on how game they were to come to campus, how much we should be reminding each other about health protocols and so on, how they handled themselves out and being with other people, how much space they needed to be given despite the easing restrictions, right? So we all had different kind of boundaries and thresholds vis-a-vis COVID-19. So it did necessitate a check for us. Secondly, there was the problem or the challenge of reintroducing regularity in students' routines. So I treated the transition as an opportunity to reintroduce a sense of regularity. In other words, for our classes, a sense of synchronicity also, especially in student study habits, because that was, of course, one of the major, that has been, not just for students, but I think for us as well, one of the biggest challenges of the pandemic situation, right? It was hard to create routines and stick to them. Right? And this was especially challenging, I think, to students who had so much to juggle and so much asynchronous work to navigate, at the same time that they had a lot of, extracurricular matters and responsibilities to navigate, and so much opportunity to procrastinate. So it was a way we had to kind of reintroduce regularity. So I thought of the face-to-face classes as a way of doing that also. So we all, I think, had to balance the conveniences of remote learning with the advantages of classroom learning. So we wanted to bring back, I personally wanted to bring back classroom discussion. I felt that was the format that I was most, that I am most, one, most comfortable in, and two, most effective in also. But we had to acknowledge the conveniences of remote learning as well, especially for students who might live in NCR but has to go through this terrible commute to get to campus and so on. So we had to balance those. A lot of the previous speakers already, I think, discussed those pros and cons at length. Fourth, I wanted, in a blended setup, I really wanted to reinvigorate classroom discussion. So maybe what just distinguishes my classroom in the past from the classrooms that had been kind of discussed in this forum so far is that I did really heavily focus on discussion. I wanted to create a space in which discussion was possible and rich most of the time. So I do have a number of asynchronous activities and asynchronous opportunities, but the main focus of my class was to bring back discussion, a more Socratic classroom. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how I tried to go about that in a bit. Increased access to campus also meant that we could already start to expand and create access to materials. I was much more careful about this during the purely online setup because I knew students did not have access to libraries. I do teach Philippine literature and English, so a lot of the materials are limited. They're limited in availability. They run out of print most of the time, and they're hard to find in bookstores, and so on and so forth. So I needed to have a greater consciousness of what I can reasonably expect my class to access, and think of ways also and opportunities for them to find alternatives if that was not possible. So solution, this was what our classroom looked like. And while we're on the subject of investments, my investment was cheaper than Tin's. It was just this Bluetooth speakerphone power conference speaker. So this was my best friend. This was my best friend during the past semester. Okay, why this choice? First, I did conduct a survey among my students on whether they wanted more face-to-face classes or if they were good with going mostly Zoom. I was resolved at that point to have more synchronous classes. So my question was really, do you want it on Zoom or do you want it face-to-face? Remarkably, a lot of them, siguro mga 50-50 siya talaga eh. Wanted Zoom, and there were some who most preferred face-to-face, but admitted that there would be times that Zoom would simply be more accessible to them, depending on whether they have classes before and after, whether their classes before or after would be on Zoom, and so on. Whatever their circumstances may be, they did say there would be times that they would be on Zoom, but generally they would prefer if we would have face-to-face sessions. And I welcome that because I'm also more comfortable in face-to-face sessions. So I did try to do it first in the classroom. So that's, I guess, the first cheat. I did try it in the classroom, but it's so difficult because of the audio setup in the classroom. The classroom has a lot of reverb, and that can actually be easily fixed with carpets and curtains to absorb sound. But I didn't have the time to set up carpets and curtains in the room. And so I ended up finding another space actually where we could just have like a conference table set up, right? So I handled it much like a meeting, because I realized also that during Zoom Zoom classes, most students, I'm sure this is your experience as well, most students actually turn their cameras off. I keep my camera on just for them to focus on something. But they could actually just go through an entire class just listening, not necessarily seeing anybody. And so that's why I decided to really focus on audio. I also, it was also a practical consideration because even for my classroom recordings before, I would mostly post the audio of the lectures and not the video, because it was it took up much less data. The size was smaller. It was just much more convenient for students. So if most of it is audio based and its video was secondary, they just needed to see the slides, then we could just focus on making sure that there is seamless audio for the classroom, that those inside the classroom, the physical classroom, can clearly hear whoever is speaking in Zoom, and those in Zoom can clearly hear whoever is speaking in the classroom. They didn't necessarily have to always see who was speaking, but they needed to hear the voice. Right? So this was my main investment. This Anchor, I'm so sorry, it sounds like an ad, but it's an Anchor PowerConf Bluetooth speaker phone. So it's a mic, it's a conference mic. Its difference from most microphones is that it has 6 microphones inside of it. So there's a there's a layout inside this nice little thing. Right? So it has 6 microphones inside. And so whoever it detects, from which direction whoever is speaking, and then the microphone closest to that person would pick up the audio and deliver it smoothly. Right? So was the most seamless. It was the most seamless arrangement that we could make. And I did ask everybody if it was working for them, especially those in the Zoom. I asked if it was working for them. Was it okay with them that this was the setup? And they said everything was clear. So we continued to do this. We continued to do this actually in class so that we could have more discussions about the texts, about the theories, and have more classroom participation. So some of the advantages of this setup, this kind of audio-based HyFlex setup, was that it really did invigorate classroom discussion. It also allowed for different modes of engagement. So it also addressed that problem in the classroom where some people might actually want to write more than they speak up. So because there was the chat available still on Zoom, I still had a lot of kids writing out their ideas in the chat box, and I would just read them aloud for everybody in the classroom. That was another adjustment that we had to do for this mode. We had to speak for listening. So I always made a point of mentioning names, like who's speaking next. So I didn't just point, I would say, yes, Alex, yes, Jethro, or whoever it is that's speaking, so that if you're listening, you know who's speaking, right? We were also aware, and we also had to exchange notes on levels of silence that would work and what kind of audio clutter we had to weed out. So for example, the Zoomers mentioned at some point that when there was collective laughter in the classroom, it tended to parang nasa swallow up yung lecture. So we made an extra point to be quiet, and not to overlap with each other or to repeat if something might have overlapped with another thing. If there were two people speaking at the same time, and so on. So we were just much more aware of that inside the classroom. But otherwise, it was quite fun because, I only had my laptop on, and the camera was only focused at me. And though I am also uncomfortable with that, I do know again that people need something to focus on. And again, what I post is usually just the audio anyway. So I don't post the video, the with video version of the classroom recording. So we also made a point of telling the Zoomers to react, so they would react all the time. They would post hearts, and then they would do thumbs up, any emoji, and also keep chatting. So anytime there was a chat, I would just regularly check, and then again, just read aloud if anybody had chats or chat messages. This kind of setup gave us a lot of flexibility. It gave opportunities for students to express themselves in different ways, whichever they were most comfortable with. We had less of a problem with looping the Zoomers in because this thing, the Bluetooth mic also functioned as the speaker. So anytime anybody spoke up in Zoom, everybody would hear because it's right in the, as you can see, it's right in the center of the room. So everybody could just hear it. So ang isa ding nangyayari, if people were running late for commute, they would log into Zoom and then would listen while on commute. And when they arrived in the classroom, they turn off the Zoom. So they would not have missed anything even if they were late. So it gave them opportunities for that also. It gave us a lot of room for accommodations because I still posted the recordings. Those who were not able to make it to class could still listen, and participate if they want to. And likewise, if I had to suddenly shift us to asynchronous for the day, that was easy enough to do for us because flexible. We'd all just be on Zoom. So for contingencies, if there were emergency meetings, especially on my end, if there were emergency meetings, we could also shift to complete asynchronous. So I would have prompts ready for parang group discussions in our Google Classroom. instead of our usual classroom setup. So it gave them a sense of regularity, and at the same time gave us a lot of flexibility to navigate different circumstances through different modes. We just had to constantly update each other and, get a habit of checking the Google Classroom for how the class would go for the day. For practical reasons, this kind of setup where we had half of the class in Zoom and half of the class face-to-face also resolved the problem of physical distancing. It's safer this way because you don't have as many people in the classroom. We were not crowding there. For the technicals and the logistics, talagang this kind of setup is best for a 10 to 12 person room. So it would guarantee, the audio quality for a 10 to 12 person room. So okay siya. It's a good number. And finally, it was just a practical consideration for the bandwidth because not all of us were online. It was a lot less difficult to stream. There were not too many people in the Zoom. So that actually takes up less bandwidth and is overall more cost effective for people. So this kind of flexibility in the audio-based kind of DIY HyFlex setup that we did also allowed us to conduct the class in a way that I felt was, more my style, and really how I can best, I think, teach my students. So it allowed us to keep that while at the same time keeping some of the best aspects of remote learning in mind or in practice for that matter. The other speakers have already spoken and shared a lot about the different activities, the range of activities that we could then assign our students in a blended environment. What I would just like to add at this point is how we also use, for my class, we also used, we assigned actually particular activities to deliberately problematize our situation. So as much as possible, wherever we could, we tried to be reflexive also in our discussion and how we were conducting them. So we had activities wherein this kind of elsewhereness of other people and then the physicality and sensoriality of the classroom were really questioned and we're interrogated and we're explored. And it was such a wonderful conversation to have actually with my students. I want to share with you two bits of writing that they did, where the prompt was really just for them to narrate what it is to be in UP. Right? Just narrate an experience that is uniquely UP. And this was actually, I had two groups at the time, one face-to-face and then one on Zoom. And we wanted to experiment with that and see, whether or not physicality and distance actually had an effect on how we perceived ourselves vis-a-vis the university. So this is one, I won't read it aloud anymore, but this is it's an excerpt from one of the submissions. And here's another one. I love this one because it deals with the reality of changes also in the university. So I don't know if you can guess which one was done by the Zoomers, and which ones were done by the face-to-face. Which one was done by the face-to-face class? But maybe you can try. Anyway, just to answer that, this first one was actually written by the Zoomers on Google Doc kasi naka-group work naman pa rin sila kahit online. And then this was done by the face-to-face group. I leave you to reflect on what were the nuances, I guess, in their observations and how they narrated their experience of the classroom and of the university. I'll just end also with sharing, again, the opportunities that this kind of blended environment has given us, I think. These were the kinds of final projects that I got this semester. So on your left, this is a scrapbook that was produced by one of my students who was constantly on Zoom. She never had the opportunity to be face-to-face, but she did a sensorial, tactile final project and just sent me the pages, of that project. So I thought that was such an interesting and unique exercise in navigating this blended space, especially because, again, she couldn't be here. So I love her choice of a sensorial mode, of expression. And then on the right side, the Gallery of Free Play is a series of hand-drawn animated hand-drawn animations by a student to interpret a work. So the opportunities that have been opened up to students for different modes of engagement and expression, I think is, burst wide open for us in this particular space and this blended space that we have. And I think that's something that we can enrich and nourish as we move forward. So I'll end there for now and hope that was somehow helpful. Let's talk about it a little more in a bit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Lujay. And that concludes our roundtable discussion. So we'll move immediately to the questions. So I'll be reading the questions in the chat, and then we'll be calling the most appropriate person, or if anybody would like to share. Like if it's an admin question, I'll course it to Ma'am Judy, for example. And if there's specific questions about specific things that the participants would like to know about what you did, then you can feel free to answer. Okay, so the first question comes from Mr. Camilo Nogoy. So he asks, how easy was it to get support from the college and university officials? And what kind of support did they give? Was it all moral support? Okay, so.
Did you want me to answer that,
Yes, Ma'am
Reese?
Judy.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Okay, was it all how easy was it to get support? Easy enough. I think that nobody stopped us. If anything, I think what stopped people in the beginning of going blended was the appendix A to R or something in the initial memo that daunted many departments and many colleges, so they didn't feel prepared. But we're the English department. You don't tell us we can't do something. So we plodded through everything anyway. We got all the answers. When we had questions, we got answers. The college, we demanded certain things from the college. We said, this is your job, this is our job. But the college naman was very willing to do the work because they realized that doing the work then would make it better for people coming in at the second semester. So it was kind of a dry run for that. So there was support, I would say. But of course, there was a lot of hard work on our part as well. We had to make sure everything was equipped. You're working with government, procurement, the classes were about to start. And I was insistent on 4 electric fans in every classroom because that was what, we needed ventilation. So we had to have 4 electric fans working in every classroom. We had to remind teachers to keep doors and windows open to make sure that air was always moving. I always had my personal CO2 monitor in class to make sure that we were not hitting 1,000, things like that, because these are things that are very important when you're teaching on site. Let's not lose sight of that. I saw the second question had to do with outbreaks. So far, none, not that I know of. I know, for example, in my own experience, twice face-to-face, after face-to-face class, the student writes me and says, "Ma'am, I tested positive when I came home this evening." So I simply tell the class, I announce it and I say, one of your classmates was in class today. He tested positive. Please be aware you've been exposed. Take precautions. So, but pretty much, I think if you keep your, not just distancing, but ventilation, we know it's an airborne disease. So open doors, electric fans running, things like that, I think will help. Okay. Thanks. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ma'am Judy. So there's another question from an anonymous attendee As someone extremely concerned about redundancy of content taught online and on-site, I'd like to ask the speakers what their best strategy is in deciding what information or content goes onto their LMS or websites and what gets to be dealt with in class, especially if teacher lectures cannot be avoided even face-to-face. So would anyone like to begin and to answer that question?
Reese, can I start? Yeah.
Okay, sure.
I'll just share
Sure,
here.
sure, Lauren. Thank you.
I guess in my case, I uploaded my course guide and the study guides all on the course site, and the students have access to all of that. But in terms of the kind of determination of the activities, it was also listed there. So in type of activity, what they can expect from a face-to-face class, what they can expect out of a Zoom class. So again, the kind of explicitness and the detail that goes into the preparation of the course guide, at least in my case, I made sure that those are specifically posted there. In terms of being redundant, I guess I think as Irish already mentioned earlier, it's the face-to-face class always serves as just a synthesis, and in my case, it kind of is a specific activity that I made sure would be worth the while of the students there. So I think as much as possible that kind of avoided the redundancy element of it. But also in my case, I think because I couldn't do what Tin had done, which is sort of this very technical kind of coordination of things, what I did was just audio guides. So if ever it was redundant, it might have been somewhat redundant for the people who were there in the physical classroom, because I then repeated that as an audio guide for those who were not there, for the benefit of those who were not there. But at least, yeah, that was my experience of it. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Next, Tin.
Yeah. Following up on what Lauren said about the synthesis sessions, I also did that similar to Lauren and Irish. And what I would do is, so for example, I would schedule a face-to-face sync meeting every 3 to 4 async meetings. And then what they did during async meetings is that they had, I usually posted discussion questions on Classroom, and then they would answer those questions. But aside from posting questions, I also asked the students to write a question themselves. And usually sometimes, or not usually, sometimes I don't even ask them a question. I just ask them to post a question. So during the sync session, the face-to-face session, we would be answering the questions that they put up on Classroom. So that kind of helps with the synthesis. Na we're not referring just to the reading itself, but it's more specifically to their questions about the reading.
Thank you. So I think there's an option for some panelists to type answers. So your other questions can also be answered by the panelists while they're typing. So I'll move on to the next question so we can accommodate more questions. From an anonymous attendee, excellent presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you. Just curious why all the panelists are female. Dr. Hick, the organizers.
Why is that a question? Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So, the next question is also from an anonymous attendee. Do you require students who live outside Luzon to be present during the face-to-face sessions, or do they have the option to join online along with the face-to-face? So, for both undergraduate and graduate contexts. So, would anybody like to answer this question about attendance and like we have seen like a variety, you
Yeah,
know.
there's a variety, and we don't require students to be present for face-to-face sessions as a blanket rule. When we did the town hall session in the beginning of the semester or before the first semester, we made sure students understood that face-to-face classes will be optional, and that as the presentations have shown, attendance was not measured through the face-to-face sessions. So they always had fully online options for people who were not able to move back to Manila since they moved out during the pandemic.
Okay, so thank you, Julie. So let's move on to the next question from from JM Zurilia. Hello, will there be policies on return, suspended, removed during the next semester's transition period to the actual return of face-to-face classes that caters to the students and teachers' needs coming back, I'm particularly concerned considering majority of the students have not experienced pre-pandemic face-to-face style classes. Like the supposed graduating batch now were freshmen pre-pandemic. So I think the question here is how do we help students transition, from they have not been to UP and then suddenly they're going to be back. So like what can we do? And nonetheless, kudos to the department and its teachers and its staff for making this first semester a very much needed breath of fresh air from the redundant and dead online setup. Thank you. Okay, so panelists, would anybody like to answer this question?
Lou J. That's student
Vice
affairs, Lou
Chancellor of
J.
Student Affairs.
Vice Chancellor of Student
Oh
Affairs.
no, I just wanted to talk about my classroom. Well, in terms of policies, the academic policies are all back. I mean, if that's what this question is asking, the acad policies are actually back. Oh no, later na yung reaction on the CHED memo on 50% contact hours and 50% online. The only difference, I think, for the next semester, the distinct difference is that everybody is required to have at least 50%, however that is quantified, 50% face-to-face component in their classes. So that's the only requirement to accommodate, I suppose, a transition period. But in relation to, for example, policies on attendance, I think that has been a very interesting point that has kept coming up now, how we kind of started taking attendance and what was our policy on attendance. That's an interesting conversation we're having, and that's something that I think teachers are also having to discover for themselves and learn for themselves on how best to do it. In my case, because it was high flex, no, so people were always here and there. It was not particularly easy to monitor where certain people were at any given time. You can't just generate the attendance sheet from Zoom like I used to do. So I had a kind of more broadly stated attendance policy actually on patterns of articulating now patterns of non-attendance. I would call your attention to that, if there were patterns of non-attendance in the classroom in any mode. So parang that worked for me, and that kind of helped me spot, where, how which people were not showing up and which people were showing up and which people were actually very participative asynchronously. So yun, it's really making us question a lot of our policies sa totoo lang, and how we go about teaching in this environment.
Okay, Irish.
I think I also like to just provide a bit of a comment on the student policies, because in my experience, it felt like I didn't feel the need to police my student attendance as much. And I think I will still do that this semester, because what happened really was that the students themselves were motivated to attend my classes. And I was also motivated, because then it was such an intentional class that they will really just have to show up there with a synthesis in mind, and then it will all be application, and it will all just be discussing with their classmates, sharing their answers with me. So I think for the university, in general, this particular experiment, if we can call it that, really revealed a lot of things that we may have to do away with, and really to kind of respect the autonomy of our students. And to be honest, I feel that last semester was also challenging, but it was also very revelatory to me as a teacher. And I think I don't have any admin lens on the policies, but thank you UP for academic freedom. But I do feel that this particular setup really allows us to be more autonomous with each other. The teacher-student non-hierarchical relationship is more possible with the setup. So I do feel that this is the best of both worlds, if I may reiterate what has been discussed earlier. So yeah, I think it lends more intentionality to our lessons and how we design our classes.
Okay, so thank you, Irish. So there seems to be a lot of questions about attendance and policy, and we've kind of established that it's still an ongoing concern, no? And I'm sure we will hear more guidelines as we prepare for the second semester. So I'll just go ahead to another question about it's more of a comment about online platforms. So I have used a different LMS since the pandemic, like Canvas, Blackboard, and Google Classroom. Canvas seems to be the best so far, so hopefully UP can consider this in the future. So I do think that we are considering it. Like there was a memo that from the OVPA about a trial run. So maybe we will see how that will go. And then yeah, there's another question here from another attendee about how many face-to-face sessions are they required to attend. So again, that's about attendance, and I'm sure clearer guidelines will be issued as the closer we get to the start of classes. So
Reese, if I may, just about guidelines and the number of face-to-face and the 50%, because that's
sure,
coming
sure.
up. If you were listening to what we were saying earlier, is that we base our policy on research. And what the research tells us, and I'd really encourage you to go to that Almoari study that I cited at the beginning, because what he says in that study, and it's a study of several experts, it's really a sliding scale. And it really depends on the nature of the class, the outcomes, the students, their conditions, the tech available, the institution, the teacher. There's so many factors. So, I mean, I don't know where Ched picked up the 50% number. I don't know the number yet, for example, because I'm still in the process of designing my classes. But what I'm keeping in mind is, from my experience last semester, is it seemed like every other week worked, but not twice. Not always 1 week you're there, 1 week you're not. Second, also, if I might share something shared by a VPAA Bautista. I was in a meeting where she was yesterday. That 50% rule is really flexible. It's not lecture time. In fact, do not waste your face-to-face time with lectures. Information, that all can be thrown online. It can be for collaborative projects. It can be group meetings. It can be library time. It can be writing time. It's not necessarily lecture time. So I think we exercise our creativity, and of course, as Iris says, our academic freedom. Because truth to tell, who's gonna check 50% nga ba? But I think what should guide us is your outcomes, the nature of the course, the students, all of these much more pressing factors that will bear on the design of your blended courses. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Judy. We probably have time just for one more question. At this point, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. So maybe is there a pahabol question from the audience? Because we're going to wrap up at 4 o'clock now, so I'm just being conscious of the time. But just in case, okay, may pahabol nga. Okay, somebody typed. Okay, very fast typing. Would it be possible to propose an experiment with a blended model where lecture-intensive sessions can be done in a large plenary composed of multiple classes integrated into one, instead of delivering it over and over again, and hold smaller tutorial-like in-person sessions for groups of 10 or smaller? It has been reported to fare much better in some contexts, as it is able to address student-specific concerns. However, I'm not sure if this goes against university policies on maintaining class sizes. Anyone? Ma'am?
Ma'am na naman. No, actually, look, yes. Is it possible? Yes. It is an exciting time to be alive because anything is possible. We're creating the new sort of pedagogy here. My only response to that is, yes, I would love to imagine a large lecture class and breakout class. And we've been thinking about how to do that with GE for years. Except that we run into problems with the way administration counts units, what counts as a load, how many hours is a load. And this is what we've been saying for years since the beginning of the pandemic, we being the English department, is that the university university has to come to terms with the different ways that we work now, and that they have to recalibrate the way that they reward work and count units and count hours. I think this is another one of those changes that will have to happen because of all that's happening in education. So for now, we just keep adjusting, so I mean, I know it's hard. I mean, it's very taxing, sure, but I tend to try to think of it the other way. It's an exciting time to be alive because you can make the new rules, right?
Okay, so thank you, Ma'am Judy. And with that, just in the interest of uh, ending, and just because we have to end at 4 o'clock. So again, thank you everybody. So we had I think a very productive afternoon, sharing everyone's experiences with online learning. So I do hope that to everybody that was here, I hope we were able to give you options, right? Like you can work with something very technical, like you could invest in different things, like Dr. Rinaldo. You can do something like what Professor Sonido did, just buy that anchor speaker. You learned from Professor Agaloos and Professor De Ocampo about what you can do in face-to-face sessions, and you also learned from uh, Dr. Santos, just like what you can do with how to transform your course guides and modules, and what to do with different activities. And we also showed what just how students responded. So like Dr. Ik said, it's an exciting time, and we are going to be moving towards this exciting time in a couple of weeks. So we really hope that this webinar was enlightening for you, and we look forward to seeing what sorts of you know experiments you're able to come up with as we go into this blended mode. So with that, we would like to following or borrowing from Dr. Santos, we hope that this was a happy blending for all of you. We wish you all a good afternoon, and thank you for being here with us today. So thank you everyone, and have a good day.